Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to this lunchtime lecture. I'm just going to say a few words about Anusuya, but many of you would have probably heard at previous summer school. She is no newcomer to summer school. She's one of our most popular presenters. But for those of you who it's the first time you're going to hear Anusuya speak, let me just say a few words. Anusuya is a paleobiologist, and she's also head of the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Cape Town. She's a global expert on the microscopic structure of the bones of extinct and extant vertebrates. In 1995, she received an NRF President Award, and in 2005, she won the South African Woman of the Year Award, which acknowledged her contribution to science, both in terms of research and science communication to the wider public. In 2005, she also won the Distinguished Women Scientist Award from the South African Department of Science and Technology. In 2012, she was awarded the NRF Transformation Award. Professor Chinsamy-Turan has published extensively, both in international scientific journals as well as in the popular press. Her book, The Microstructure of Dinosaur Bone, Deciphering Biology Through Fine-Scale Techniques, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2005. She has also written a popular book for children, Famous Dinosaurs of Africa, which was published in, sorry, I got my pages wrong, which was also published in South Africa. Okay, sorry. I've got the wrong. Okay.
I'm going to have to hold it. Okay, hi everyone. I am absolutely delighted to see so many of you here. For those of you that have known me for a while, you know I usually give a series of lectures, but for the past 2 years I've been really very, very busy. But I still decided last year to share with you some of our research on the big giant birds from Australia. And I should let you know that that research is still going on. We're actually doing a lot more on that. And the project has grown. We now have a discovery grant to take that project even further. So next time I'll tell you more about that. And this time I'm going to talk to you about some work that we've done on the dodo. But before I go on, I just want to point out that I've been so busy because besides my research, I've also been doing this online course called Extinctions Past and Present. Now, I know some of you here have done it, and can I see with a show of hands how many of you have done it? Okay, wonderful. So I should tell you that over the past year, we've reached more than 10,000 people in the world with this course. And I should boast a little bit because our course is now in the top 50 MOOCs worldwide. And believe me, that's quite an accomplishment. That's quite an accomplishment because there are 8,400 MOOCs in the world. So people, if you haven't done it, for those of you that haven't done it yet, I think you should do it. It's completely free. Okay, please pass this around. And if you know of somebody who would be interested, you can take extra ones. So it's going to start on the 5th of February, and it's free, so you don't pay anything. You can do it in your own time, at your leisure. All you need is an internet connection. That's it. You need a good internet connection because there's lectures, there's visits, there's various things. And if you want to know more, I can certainly tell you more about it. But please take pamphlets, and if you know other people that would be interested, spread the word about it because that is one of my passions, is to do science communication. And you'll see that with the pack that was given to you at the door, there's actually a single page handout about science communication survey. Please, can you fill it in? I'm going to collect that at the end of this lecture. So it's really important that you fill it in. We're doing another study that we're very, very keen to get more data on. Okay, now for the lecture on the dodo. Okay, so this research was done together with my colleagues. These are the people that I've worked with. Delphine Angst was a postdoc in my lab, And she is actually a French woman. She came to do her postdoctoral research with me, and her main research was on the guinea fowl. But on the side, we did this project on the dodo, and it really was so fascinating, and we actually had a paper in Nature with this, so I thought I'll tell you about this research that we did. So many of you know the dodo, and it often is portrayed as this quite dumb-looking bird. But I don't know how many of you know that its closest relatives are pigeons. It's actually in the Columbiformes. So it was a fairly big pigeon, about 1 meter tall, mass of about 10 kilograms, maybe more. Some people say up to about 15 to 17 kilograms. So quite a big bird. And I'm sure you also know that it's endemic to Mauritius. So we have in Madagascar, we have Aepyornis, which is a giant bird. So this is part of my research is on giant birds. So I'm interested in birds and how they get to the giant form. So that's why the Australian birds interest me, the dromornithids. And in Madagascar, I have a project on Aepyornis, which is another giant bird. It's popularly called the elephant bird. And in Mauritius, we have the giant bird in the form of the dodo. And close by, in the other islands, the Mascarene Islands, there are other big birds called solitaire. So on the islands, it looks like there is a phenomenon for some of these birds to actually reach big proportions. So we know that they were first described, I shouldn't say discovered as I put in apostrophes, in 1598. And people describe them, mainly sailors describe them in their notes. So in the diaries of sailors, you'd find these descriptions about the dodo. And as you all know, the dodo has become somewhat of an icon for animals that have gone extinct because of human activities. And so many of these other animals we know also have become extinct quite recently. So there are many such animals, but the dodo generally is quite an iconic symbol for extinction caused by humans. And the strangest thing is that even though the dodo was contemporaneous with humans, that during the time humans and the dodo were around, there was no studies that were done on them. There's no natural history data about the dodo. And we know absolutely little about its ecology. So we know nothing about how long it took to grow up. We don't know when it laid its eggs. We don't know what color it was. This information is all lacking, even though this bird was contemporary with humans. From the bones that have been found, we know something about its taxonomy. So we know it's related to pigeons. We have information about its phylogeny. We know something about an estimated body mass. Given the bones that we have, you can estimate the body mass. How did it move? You know, what kind of locomotion? Was it gracile? Was it a fast cursorial runner? Was it a plodder? We don't actually know. Only what we can deduce is from the bones themselves. What did it eat? We're also not sure. And how it reproduced, also, there's no information. I mean, it's like ridiculous to think that people observed them, they were there. I mean, you know, there were lots of people who visited the islands, but there's still no information about its ecology. Some of you also know that my research area is bone microstructure, so bone histology. That's what that means, the microscopic structure of bones. And from the microscopic structure of bones, we can make deductions about biology. And so I've done a lot of work on dinosaurs, on early birds, on a variety of even modern animals. And what we decided to do was look at the bone histology of the dodo to try and determine aspects of its biology. So, if you look at bones generally, when you look at just the actual whole bone, you can study its anatomy. You can look at its shape, you can look at its form, you get an idea about the gross morphology of that bone. And then, if you make a section of it, you get a micro anatomical level of anatomy. So it's another level. But when we look at histology, you can't see the histology with the naked eye. You have to make a thin section of the bone, and that section is then examined under the microscope. And under the microscope, you then can find these channels where the blood vessels go through. You will see the bone cells. You will see the organization of the bone. And the fascinating thing about the fossil record is that even after millions of years, so even for dinosaurs, the bone microstructure is preserved. And that bone structure can tell us something about the biology of the animal. So, the dodo, being relatively recent, we kind of suspected that we would actually have good bone structure, because sometimes the bones can degenerate. But most of the time, we find there is good bone structure, and we had a feeling that because it's so relatively recent, we'd be fine. So, the first step, of course, is to get hold of some dodo bones. So what we tend to do is we take the fossil bone, we cut a piece of it out, we embed that into a block of resin. The resin then penetrates the bone and fills up all the pore spaces within the bone, because if we just put it to a saw, it can break, and we wouldn't be able to get the thin structure that we need to look under the microscope. So it's embedded, it's mounted onto a slide, and then we end up with a thin section which we examine under the microscope, and that actually gives us the information about the biology of the animal. So, where do we get dodo bones from? As you probably know, they are extinct, they are rare, and museums are generally not keen to give their specimens for this kind of analysis. So, usually I beg and plead and really try and get some material. And this time we were actually very, very fortunate. So Delphine and I were at a conference, and we met up with this person called Julian Hume, and he had his own personal collection of dodo bones, okay? And he allowed us to section some of the material from his sample, so not the perfect bones, the fragmentary bones, the ones where the ends were missing or the shafts were broken. Those were the ones he offered us. We got some from the Rodrigue collection, and we got some from the Dodo research program, again, by selecting just the fragmentary bones. And so we had like about maybe, I think it was about 10 samples to begin with from all over. And then by chance, this person called Paul Curry, he used to own part of the land where the dodos were found, the fossils were found. And he had contacted my student because she was in France, remember? And his family are now in France. And the family said that they basically have this collection of dodo bones, and they want to now donate it for research. And so we got that material. So the best of that material went to a museum, but again, we chose the bones that people are not going to miss because they really are incomplete. So this is the kind of material that we ended up working on. So not perfect bones, but really very nicely preserved nevertheless. So we end up with 22 of these bones, and you can see they were humeri, they were tarsal metatarsi, they were tibiotarsi, and femora. So mostly bones of the limb, but also bones of the forearm as well. So from these bones, we know that they came from two different parts of Mauritius. These Marais Osongs, this is where the Paul Curry family had the bones from, mainly because this is the area that he actually that he owned. And these cave sites, actually, can you see that as a cave? Does it make the slides darker? I can do that actually. Yeah, and so the whitish bones are generally from the, let me just do this first, backlights. Okay, so the whitish bones are the ones that we know that came from the cave. And in fact, it's a different study, but we're looking at the differences in the preservation of the two bones. Besides the coloration, there's also different chemical analysis that we are busy with on this. But nevertheless, so I'm very pleased to tell you that we were able to get some fascinating information about the dodo in terms of how did they grow? That's called ontogenetic growth, from little chicks to adults. How did they grow? We were able to identify the sex of the dodo because, remember, from the bones, it's very difficult to identify the sex. But from the bones, from the bone histology, we were able to identify females in the species. We also were able to get information about molting, okay? And we were able to put together a life history for the dodo on the basis of the bone microstructure. So the first question is that if you have just those dodo bones that I showed you, how can we distinguish between adults and juveniles, besides the size, okay? So size can tell you something about, the bones are very porous and they're very tiny, so it can suggest there's a difference in size. But in terms of bone microstructure, we can say something about how they grew. So this is important. It's not just about it's a juvenile or it's an adult, but something about how did this animal actually grow. And this is a section of a juvenile dodo. And if you look at the bone tissue, this is the actual microstructure. And we see that if you just look at it, even for your untrained eye, you'll see this band of bone and this band of bone. They're very clearly two major types of bone tissue that you can see. And these channels, all these channels here that you see, these are all where the blood vessels penetrate the bone. And so, during early ontogeny, during early stages of development, we know that they grew very fast. This is the kind of bone tissue that we find in their bones. And later on, after the bones actually expand to the size that they need to be, they have a very special tissue that's formed, and that tissue is called the inner circumferential lamella. It's written here, the ICL, and the tissue actually changes. This is a more slowly formed bone. So we know early growth is very rapid. As the animal matures, we have this kind of bone that forms, and then we wondered, what about the adults? And in the adults, we see that at the end of the bone, the outside part of the bone, there's a different kind of tissue that forms. And this tissue actually is, again, similar to that ICL, and it has these rings in the outermost part. So these are called legs, which stands for lines of arrested growth. So in the mature dodo, we found that many of them had these lines, and some of them up to about 5 to 6 of these growth lines in their bones. When we look at modern vertebrates, we know that they also, upon maturity, once they reach sexual maturity, they grow slowly, and many of them are affected by environmental conditions, and they deposit these legs, these lines of arrested growth. So we could say that the very large dodo bone that we had in our sample was at least 6 years old. So it tells us about the age of the animal from the bone itself. But one of the things that we wondered about was that in these bones where we had the legs preserved, what causes them? Because we know that the legs, they indicate an interruption in the rate at which bones are growing. So something must be happening that actually causes a cessation of growth. And the question is, what is it? When we look at reptiles today, we know that crocodiles, snakes, a variety of turtles, all of them are affected by the unfavorable season, which is winter for them. And during the winter periods, they deposit these lines of arrested growth. And the question then was, why does the dodo actually form these lines of arrested growth? And so we think that if we know from modern animals that it's some kind of environmental stress that results in these. But Mauritius, it's very stable. We don't think of Mauritius as having an unfavorable environment. Most people go and escape to Mauritius for leisure. But, in fact, we know that there is, during the summertime, cyclones. And it's the only thing that we can think of that may be indicative of what is an unfavorable season for the dodo. Because during the cyclone, we know that many trees get completely denuded, the fruits, there aren't any food available, and we think that this may have had a significant impact on the dodo themselves. And we propose that in the dodo, the legs, these rings that form, actually happens during the summertime. So that gives us an idea about when they're growing slowly. Now, how do we identify the sex of a bird? How do we know which is male and which is female? And for a long time, we really didn't have a clue how to do this. But then we realized that female birds, all female birds, before they lay their eggs, so during ovulation, they have a particular bone tissue that forms inside the medullary cavities. So in the long bones, particularly long bone, but other bones as well, so in the marrow cavity, there's these bones that actually form during ovulation. And when the bird lays the eggs, they use that bone to make the eggshell, because the eggshell requires calcium. And so they basically deposit this bone. It's all under control of hormones. During ovulation, the hormones actually trigger the formation of bone in the medullary cavity. During the egg-laying phase, that bone is all resorbed. Okay, so this medullary bone is resorbed, and the eggs are then laid. And we also can say in this case here, we see it's an individual that has just matured. So we can see there's one ring there, and here's the bone that formed during early ontogeny, and here's the ICL. So basically, that kind of deduction immediately allows us to identify a female. This obviously is a female here with a pretty flower in its head. Okay, so basically, the observation of medullary bone allows us to identify the females. And then, what about molting? So we know that, of course, birds molt to renew their feathers, and we found that in many of our samples, we had these large cavities that developed inside their bones. So, and it was across, whether it was male or female, we still found these very, very large cavities. And we know from studies on modern birds, particularly penguins that undergo catastrophic molt, we know that they also, during molting, the feathers fall out, but new feathers have to grow. And the new feathers actually require calcium, and they take it from their bones. And so we basically, again, think that these large cavities that are very unusual generally for birds, except for molting birds, we think that they are indicative of molting in these birds. And what else we can say is that this is an adult bird with 2 growth rings, and it has an ICL, and it has these large cavities that form. So we know that clearly molting actually is important, and during molting, birds actually can look very different from their winter plumage, and summer plumage can look very different because, of course, in between is the molt that actually happens. And this is important because I'm going to refer to some of the sailors' descriptions of the dodos now. So, what can we say about the description of the dodo? Now, for a long time, when you look at all these historical documents, we know that all the descriptions that were made were not done by naturalists, they were done by sailors. But they seem to have described the dodo, and the descriptions always seem to be very conflicting. So they will write about the dodo and say the dodo had 3 or 4 black quills, a tail, and there were 4 or 5 curled plumes of grayish color. So they actually were describing different states. And here they describe downy feathers with 3 small plumes, and here basically fine down. So some of them mention the feathers as down, some of them just describe like sparsely feathered birds. So what we did was we looked at all the diaries because they were dated, and we were able to see when did the sailors describe the birds in a particular way. Okay? And we basically then were able to try and fit this into a calendar year to see where did we think these birds actually molted. Now, until now, there was only one study by Staub who actually proposed that this is, so the green refers to egg laying and the red refers to molting, and he proposed that this was the periods that the bird actually reproduced and molted. And the strangest thing is that the Staub hypothesis was actually very strange because he based it on what people were saying about the dodo's meat, when the sailors said the meat tasted good. And he said that basically the good taste of the meat actually means that they ate well, and this actually then allows the dodo to be having that period of growth that he ascribed to it. So there wasn't actually real data that he used. And furthermore, when we look at this and we look at all other birds on Mauritius, on the island, and how they actually, their reproductive time and when they actually molt is completely different to what was proposed for Staub. So that alone told us that there's some other issue that we need to look at. So this is just showing you that the egg-laying period is different from all other birds, and here we're seeing the molting period is different from other birds. So we said, if we have the legs in the bones that tell us when it was summertime and when the height of summer was happening, we can use that to try and synchronize which time of the year these events were actually happening. So if the leg forms, we can say the leg forms at this point, when the height of the season. Is it just after or a long time after? So how much of bone is being formed after the leg has been deposited? So we know that medullary bone tells us about ovulation, and if we look at this part of the bone, we see that here we have these legs, and between them we have amount of bone that's being deposited. So if this is the leg and there's a long time that goes between them, we can actually say that there's been several months that has lapsed since the leg was formed, as opposed to immediately after the leg was formed. Okay? So if a bird had died immediately after the leg was formed, it means that it would have died in the height of summer. Whereas in this case, we can see that it lived because there's so much more bone that formed. And so using this information, we're then able to work out when the leg formed, we're able to work out how much more bone actually was deposited, and then when ovulation probably occurred. Because again, the state of the medullary bone can tell us whether it's an early stage of formation or whether it's already being depleted. Okay? So it's like a forensic study, this, because we're kind of trying to deduce all this from the bones. And so then, of course, the breeding period would be from the time the birds are building their nests and ovulating, so before the eggs are even laid, then the eggs get laid, of course, the chicks, and then, of course, the maturation of the chicks. And so the molting, what we were able to deduce with this, we said that if you look at the bones where the cavities are present, again, it can tell us something about the age if we look at when the lag occurs. So in this case, we had a lag and hardly any growth that occurred after that. And we know that it must have happened soon after summer. So that allows us to deduce when molting actually happened. And when we separate all these sailors' reports into different months of the year, so between June and July, these match up in terms of when they actually were molting, and these actually match up in terms of the non-molt period, so when the birds actually had a better plumage. So this then allowed us to put in this information about their life history. So again, we don't have molting dodo pictures, so we've just used the penguin as an example. And you can see very clearly also with the penguin how the molt occurs. So the feathers are not so beautiful as in the new plumage. They shed the old one, and eventually you have the downy feathers, and finally you have the new plumage. And so we think very similar thing probably happened with the dodo. So this is the new life history trends that we suggest, with this being the egg-laying period over this time, and it matches much better with modern birds. This is the old hypothesis, but all these are the modern ones, and it looks like the molting period also matches better with modern birds as well. So this allows us to make these deductions. So when we look at the bone histology, we see that it allows all these deductions about the dodo, which we didn't know until now. So we're able to distinguish between the juveniles and the adults on the basis of the kind of bone tissue that's formed and the rate at which the bone is also formed. We also can identify the females of the species, and we can now say that they molted, and more clearly when these reproductive periods and molting times actually occurred. So if we look at a calendar year, we can see what happens at different times of the year in the dodo's life. So we can certainly see during the, so if you look at this stage here, we see the eggs are laid, the birds hatch, and then they grow very quickly. And by the time the mid of the bed season arrives, the chicks have grown up. They're already adult size. And they experience their first harsh season, they develop the legs, and then they molt. And the next time they have their very nice plumage, they're fully adult. The birds actually, female birds would deposit medullary bone and get ready for the next season of laying eggs. And so this is now the new data for the life history of the dodo, and it's been really so fascinating, and people have been so interested in this research because it's never been known before. And using the bones of the animal, we were able to make all these deductions. So yeah, that's the last slide, so thank you. Have I gone too quickly? Oh, hi. So we have plenty of time for questions. Yes. So the shape of the beak is known because there are some beak specimens that have been found, and so the shape is clearly that. And we think that the pointy beak, so in many cases people think that pointy beak we may have thought them to be a flesh-eating bird, but there doesn't seem to be any indication that they were actually flesh-eating. It may have just been for them to dig and to maybe just use the beak to open up food and probably fruit.
Did they fly?
No. They'll be too heavy, and in fact my student Delphine has done some other work looking at their bones, and we think that they were actually certainly not capable of running. They were not like an ostrich, that they were more slow moving, so more plodding kind of birds rather than ones that were lightly built for speed. We don't think they were swimmers, no. No. Yes?
I don't know how close Mauritius to the equator is.
the difference in climatic conditions, cold, summer, winter?
There is a slight the seasonal difference is mainly got to do with rain. So it's more wet, dry. And the cyclones is in the summer season. So temperature doesn't change much, but it's rather rainfall that is. Yeah. Yes.
All this information is very good to know about the dodo. Does this feed into anything else? Like, I'm just thinking of a quagga, or what else would it feed into?
So this is my research, as I said, is bone microstructure. So I work on many different animals, modern animals and fossil. And so fossil, I think most of you, or many of you know that it's mainly to do with dinosaurs, and again, working out life history data for dinosaurs. Early birds, so before we have modern birds, we have many different kinds of early birds, and for those early birds, I've also done lots of studies about the biology of those early birds. And more recently, well, not really recently now, but I worked on conservation, because what happens is that if you look at some animals, particularly reptiles, I said they form these growth rings. And I was contacted by people working in the Amazon who were looking at the growth and biology of basically endangered turtles. And they had no life history data to work out anything about these animals. Excuse me? So it was basically these turtles. And so what I did was we managed to get some of the bones of the turtle that had already been killed, and then using bone microstructure and skeletochronology, which is basically the bone and time, we were able then to give them information about the life history about these particular turtles. So they call Podonymus expensa. So the ramifications is that because bone doesn't change over time, you can apply it for many, many things. I think some of you may have seen there was this new paper that we just published very recently on osteomyelitis, which is the disease that occurs in humans today, in various animals as well. And we were able to identify osteomyelitis in a 265 million year old animal. Yeah. So that information, I think there's some information about this on the summer school Facebook site, and you certainly will find it. If you also go to our Extinctions Past and Present Facebook site, there's certainly information there. So yeah, so it's fascinating. I mean, what I've been interested in is that if we look at bone disease, for example, I mean, when we look at pathologies, most of the time the pathology affects the soft tissue. But over time, in the fossil record, all the soft tissue decomposes, but the bones are preserved. And we've been able to identify several diseases in the fossil record on the basis of the bones. So, the study is actually so wide, and there's just so many things that one can actually do.
Can you offer any explanation why this particular bird was found in this particular place and planet?
So, it's an interesting question. What we know about the dodo, we think its ancestor was a pigeon, so a flying bird. It arrived on the island. This is the hypothesis. So it arrives on the island, and we think that, to fly is energetically very expensive, and being a bird, a pigeon generally is fairly big anyway, but being on the island and not actually having any natural predators until humans came along, there was no need to actually be fast or get away from people, and they basically over time just adapted to life in the slow lane. And so they basically just took it easy, and basically their flight became redundant for them. They didn't need flight. And very much the same way, we think that Aepyornis, the elephant bird, we know that the elephant bird, the closest living relative of the elephant bird is actually the kiwi, which is in Australia. And we know that New Zealand, sorry. And we know that both of these birds, probably their ancestor is a flighted bird that came from Australia. You see, and when they arrive on the island with no pressure to grow fast, they basically take the option to grow slow. And in fact, when we look at the bones, and this is my work currently on the Aepyornis, they actually are so slow growing, they take like about 11 to 15 years to grow up. Do you know the kiwi is that size? The kiwi is known to take 9 years to grow to adult size. And we know that because it has these growth rings in their bone. So it's like really interesting in environments. Island environments actually allow animals to change their body sizes. And often what you will see is that big animals become small. So you've heard of dwarf elephants, okay? That's the phenomenon. So on a big island, on a big landmass, you have big elephants. And on the small islands, like in the Mediterranean, you have these dwarf elephants. And the adults are like about that size, and the babies are 30 centimeters, so like about that size, a length of a ruler. They're that tall. And the flores, excuse me? Exactly. The flores human, it's the same phenomenon. It's basically on an island and body size changes. So you can get the development of big taxa or small body size. So it, depending on what the animal is actually doing, it adapts to that lifestyle in a particular way. So there are many, many examples. I mean, there's the Myotragus is also a goat that becomes so small. And there's a hippo, there's a pygmy hippo, there's many examples in island environments where we see these changes in body sizes.
What is the advantage to them?
So being small, if you were a big elephant, you eat a lot, okay? But if you're a smaller elephant, your needs are actually less because on an island you have limited resources. So resource limitation is often one of the biggest drivers for body size change. And of course, what else is driving the changes depends on what other animals are with you in the ecosystem. So, you know, if you need to escape from predators, if there's no big predators chasing you, all that will also affect the final outcome of what natural selection will determine as the best possible way for you. Okay. Yeah.
An interesting thing about the purple gallinule, which is now called a swamp hen. The first time I saw them was up in Botswana, and they're very secret. And I went to New Zealand, and in Christchurch, where my son was living, they had a breeding place of this particular bird called a peacock. I was going around there and I saw one purple gallinule stealthily taking photographs, took a couple more steps, and there was another one, and they were absolutely overrunning and not scared of anything. And I thought, why are the ones in Botswana so secretive, and these ones couldn't care about anything? And it's because there's no predators, no natural predators in New Zealand.
But they're not exactly the same, aren't they? This is the kakapo, hey?
No, not the kakapo. The kakapo, which is a purple gallinule, but it's got a Maori name.
Oh, okay.
It's exactly the same.
So obviously, it again has to do with the evasion of predators. Yeah.
Is that natural, or is an exotic? Is that endemic to New Zealand, or exotic?
Where it was in
Christchurch
was a breeding area, but they are the same genetically as a purple gallinule, which is now called a swamp.
Interesting. Okay, you had a question? Yes, the sailors. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what they were referring to, the taste. So Starb actually used he basically said that people were saying that the taste of the dodo is better at a certain time of the year because of how they were tasting. And he said that was probably the time when the food was plentiful.
And they just got hunted out.
Yes, yeah. Okay, there we go.
I'm just going through what you said, and in 1598 they were discovered by the sailors, and so I'm presuming by 1700 they were extinct. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
And was that totally due to the fact that they were being eaten, or was it disease as well?
We don't think disease. We think that the people were basically harvesting them. They were basically taking them on the ships because you can get fresh meat. So taking them as live animals and then killing them later. So that's certainly one of the strongest indications that they were actually killed for their meat. But we don't see any trace of diseases or anything in the bones. All the bones seem to be normal. And if there was disease, of course it could be that we won't see it in the bones. Sometimes disease doesn't affect bones. But so far the bones we looked at doesn't show disease. Even in the anatomy there isn't any kind of preponderance of particular kind of disorders. So there doesn't seem to be anything. No. Yes?
What age did records show that they lived?
How old? So the largest one in our collection was 6 years. So we don't see any more further growth rings, and we think that probably that was actually how long they lived. So the longevity was probably that time. And the gentleman behind you? Yes.
You used bones from collection, but are there not surely a lot of bones found that could be found?
Not anymore. So now apparently it's so you mean to be found still in Mauritius? Yeah. So apparently it's more restricted to be able to excavate new material. So we haven't been, we've asked, and we were told that, the new collections are not actually being encouraged, and basically the museum in Mauritius is controlling what actually happens there, and they're not actually putting any effort to collect more dodo bones. Yeah. Okay, there's a question.
When you said the dodos were 6 years old, was it not just the bones that you managed to get were dodos that had been killed prematurely? It wasn't dead from natural causes, but from being killed?
Well, it's possible, but a lot of our material actually was excavated from the various sites, either from the caves or from the marsh area. So they were actually collected. And it doesn't look like it was a food dump. Is that what you're suggesting, that it was like a food dump? It wasn't a food dump. It looks like they were actually places where they actually died. But you are right, though, that our sample is only a subset of the population. And there may have been even older dodos, but we can't say that. From our sample, that was the oldest one that we had. Yeah, but as I said, the kiwi, we know, takes up to 9 years to reach that body size that it has. So it's possible. There we go.
In the Natural History Museum in Oxford, there's a stuffed dodo, which inspired Lewis Carroll. Are there many examples of complete skeletons?
No. There are very, very few specimens, and that is one of the rare ones, in fact. So that's actually, it's so sad that, we all know the dodo, we kind of grow up knowing the dodo is extinct, but we know nothing about them. Yeah, and even that one, there's some controversy about that particular specimen itself. Yeah. Well, there's apparently it wasn't very well cared for as a taxidermy specimen, so the color has actually already faded, and it's not the true color of the dodo. So although it gives us an idea about the size, I'll help you. Although it gives us an idea about the size, it actually is not a true reflection of how it actually looked. Yeah.
Did the sailors also eat the eggs, or did they only collect the adults?
Don't know.
Are there no reports?
We don't know. They don't talk about the eggs. Unlike the Epionis, of course, where the eggs were collected. because Epioneus eggs are huge. They're like 7 liters. I mean, big, giant eggs, and certainly Epioneus eggs were collected and eaten.
Bigger than ostrich.
Yeah, bigger than ostrich for sure. Yeah, and they're the largest eggs ever laid by any bird or any vertebrate. So huge, big, giant eggs.
Sorry, can I just ask the modality of bird?
Yes.
Which gives them calcium for
Yeah.
the eggs. Is that common to all birds, in fact, the eggs?
Well, we think so far all birds that we know that have been found when they're reproducing and when they have brooding patches on them showing that they were sitting on eggs, they all seem to have formed medullary bone. I think it's more rare. I don't know for sure. It's difficult to say whether all birds do it, so I'm trying to be a bit more cautious here. So it seems generally female birds form medullary bone during ovulation. And I think it probably also has to do with the fact that the demand for calcium is so high that if they take calcium from their already small, thin bones, they will compromise the strength of their bones. So it seems that this is a way out. I mean, when we think about alligators, for example, laying eggs, they don't have a problem because their bones are very thick-walled. So they can take calcium from their bones, and they also take calcium from their osteoderms. But I think birds themselves, actually, the bone wall is so thin that if they begin to deplete the bone from the bone walls and then have molting on top of that, they actually will really mechanically compromise their strength. Yeah.
I read a book many years ago now about the process of extinction and the process of what the author called rarity unto death.
Okay.
And he or she, I can't even remember now, sketched a word picture and a sketch of the dodo and created 3/4 of a page look at the dodo in extinction. And it just broke my heart. There it was, bemused, fronty, quite incompetent looking, and looking around the vast creature of its kind on the face of the earth. I've always remembered this being so terribly touching.
Yeah. Well, I think we don't have to look at the dodo to feel that, because if we think about all that's happening these days, we are living on the brink of the 6th extinction. And I think that for those of you that haven't done my course, the last week actually focuses on the 6th extinction. And we talk about 6th extinction in terms of terrestrial animals, in terms of flying animals, and animals in the water. So we will look at different environments as well. So yeah, so there's so much to be said about in terms of what we are doing to the environment, and there are so many animals that are really on the brink of extinction. Let's leave it there. Okay, people, thank you very much. No. Only Mauritius, because again it's island environment. So they change on the island because it's an island. Exactly. Because they also.
All on this one.
No, of course it's about everything. So what you should do is you should go and just look up the link, and then there's a little. Yeah. 5th of February it's starting. Oh, I should have announced actually. Hey, 5th of February. You did the dromornithids, yeah. But now the MOOC is actually, it's a little bit about everything. Yeah. And it's 5 weeks. You must do it. You must do it actually. It's really nice.